Oh my god, this looks like such a mess. Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about the Stardust Remaster for hopefully less than an hour, but we'll see how it goes. This is, without a shadow of a doubt, the best song I've ever put out, and I'm actually quite interested to talk about how it was made, because it's probably the longest I've ever spent on a single project, and I threw so many different ideas in here. And yeah, so let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is the history. This will be brief, but Stardust was the first song I ever made in Ableton. It's the first original on the channel. The things I had uploaded before then were made in Soundtrap, and if you don't know what that is, I envy you. But it's basically an online DAW that you can use for free, but especially these days you need to buy the premium to get any use out of it. And what I used to do was just drag MIDIs into it, change some instruments, slap the word remix in the title, and then upload it and call it a day. I was not even in high school by that point, so this was quite a while ago. But I got Ableton for the first time after getting my first job, and I saved up enough money for the light license. And so the first song I made in it was Stardust, because it was a project I had actually started in Soundtrap, but I then ported it over to Ableton and finished it there. Many people have pointed out that it sounds remarkably similar to Megalovania, which is unfortunately not an accident, because I stole the bass line from Megalovania, that sort of chromatic drop starting from D and the key of D minor, and I built the melody on top of that. So I like to think I've made it my own thing now, but it is kind of embarrassing to admit that. Those of you who have been around for a while may remember the fact that there's about 150 different versions of Stardust on the channel. Most of them are unlisted now. In fact, I think the only ones you can still access are the original and the remaster, although you can still get to the other ones through the originals playlist if you want to hear how many different times I tried to make this one song sound good. I think the only time I actually succeeded was with the remaster, but you know, it is what it is. Enough yapping about that, let's actually get into the project. So I'm going to try to divide this up into different sections. The song has a lot of them. Like, I would call this intro, then we have, you can't really even call this a drop, like a build-up, Buildup I, and then like Predrop 1, then of course Drop 1, then Break 1, Buildup 2, then Orchestral Section. And that's not even halfway, like, there's a lot to work through, so we'll start with the intro. So introducing this song is this pad. This is just a stock Ableton instrument. I made some tweaks to it, threw a utility onto it with some width, and it sounds like this. Pretty simple. And it just plays the bass line in the beginning here. I solo it out. Not really much to say there. Fills out the sound stage. The next thing you hear is this vital instrument. This is just some preset. I took some analog thing, threw some effects onto it, some reverb, some utility, and you have this melody here, which is entirely original actually. This isn't part of the original Stardust, but it sounds like this. Bit dissonant, but you know, it kind of works with the intro idea. This plays for a while until eventually at the next bar we kick into the actual Stardust melody. And the project actually slowly speeds up as it does that, so you can see up here there's some automation with the BPM of the project. Some other instruments slowly kick in during this part too, like this synthesizer here that I made. This is just a Chip Sounds triangle. I tweaked it a little bit. As well as the actual bass instrument, which is just a bass guitar. This Ample Bass 2, like, this is the best free electric bass guitar plugin you can get. I highly recommend this. Good job to these guys. But again, just a very simple thing. You know, those instruments slowly get louder as we fade in. And then the drums, which I'll talk about them eventually. People have raved about the drums, and it's definitely some of my best work. But I will talk about this drum fill intro here. So the drum kit I'm using is MT Power Drum Kit 2. This is a free VST drum kit, and it is awesome. I think I've used this in almost every project since Adrenaline, I think is the first time it appeared. And it is sick. There's so much you can do with it, especially if you apply some effects. Usually I slap some OTT onto it as well. If you're not a music producer, OTT is basically just a really big compressor. There's some visualization here in the drum kit you can see if I play it. One thing about the drum production in this song that we'll talk about later is that there's a lot of toms, and I think that adds to the style, but we'll move on from the intro now, and we'll talk about this sort of first build-up section. So obviously the vital instrument is still kicking around. We're up to the proper DPM on the project now, and the lead is also an octave higher than it was. One thing I should mention that I hadn't mentioned before is that unlike the original Stardust, which is in the key of D minor, this is in the key of D flat minor or C sharp, depending on how you look at it. I like to call it D flat because I tuned everything down, but it doesn't really make much of a difference. I still have this pad playing the bass, and it layers nicely with the actual bass guitar. You can hear if I turn them both on. You get a pretty wide bass sound, though YouTube's probably compressing the fuck out of it. If you want to hear this song in all of its glory, you can always go to buymeacoffee.com/maxvelocity and pay for the max membership tier. Anyway, next we have a couple other instruments playing the lead. So first is this, they call it Awesome Piano. This looks really cheap. I wanted a piano that sounded like an old out-of-tune, saloon piano. And you hear it very much has that sort of sound and timbre. Extremely basic, and it's not all that interesting on its own. But it sounds really good when you layer it with the other leads. And the next is this chip sound synth again. This is the same one we looked at before. And there's this Darksaccord, they call it. I've had this for a long time. I think I actually used it for the first time in my Pandora Palace remix from ages and ages ago. This is just, it's a really interesting sounding harpsichord, and it sounds really neat down here in these lower registers, but it gets really droney and airy in the high registers. But I just used it to play a arpeggiated octave version of the bass line. So if I layer that with the other bass instruments, we get a pretty nice bass sound. And of course there's the drums, which in this case are playing a few different fills. These are actually references to other fills from previous versions of the song. So in Stardust V2, there was a lot of this style where each bar would be accented with a different style of drum fill. So in this case, we have a standard tom fill. In this one, we have some rides. This one was made up for the remaster, but I just wanted something different so I wasn't repeating a bunch. We have our first snare here, because there's some snares in this last fill here, and I didn't want them just kind of coming out of nowhere. And then this is a more standard fill, or bar, I guess. Then the second part of the build-up, which is very similar, we add one more lead instrument. This synth is awesome. Kudos to whoever made this preset. I tweaked it a little bit, obviously. And we'll talk about, what effect this plays in the song a little bit later. The only other thing that really comes in at this point is this music box. This is the Spelldosta music box made by Vintergatan and I don't know how to say it. Klevgear? I'm not entirely sure. Vintergatan are one of my favorite bands. I saw Martin's video on this music box, and it is one of the few paid plugins I have. That being said, it's not expensive, so if you're in the market for a decent sounding music box, I highly recommend it. The reason there's a music box here is because most of the original Stardust had bells playing the main melody of some kind, so I kind of wanted to, call back to that with this instrument, and it sounds pretty good. You may also notice that this is a highly, stylized version of the Stardust lead. There's a lot of accent notes, and it changes at the end of the bars a whole bunch, like stuff like this. things like that. There's also this Brainstormer square wave. Brainstormer is an extremely basic 3 oscillator synthesizer. It's kind of like if 3XOS from FL Studio was good. It's extremely basic, but all I'm using it for is to have a square wave that continuously pitches up. If I open up the envelopes here and we go to pitch bend, you can see acts as a riser. And the fade out there at the end. And of course, when that happens, we get the first sort of break part here. The pre-drop, I guess, is a good name for it. And we transition into it like this. So this is kind of like, where it really becomes Stardust. Most versions of Stardust didn't have all of this intro and the build-up section and all that. Most of the versions of Stardust just start here with the basics, which is just, we have the vital synth and the music box playing the lead together. And then the only other thing here is the bass. Makes for a very simple beginning, sort of. And then there's this riser, which is a stock Ableton sample. Just throw some reverb and delay and some width onto it. People who have been around for a while know that this sample is in a lot of my songs, and it's because it's just really good, and I know how to work with it pretty well. So the first part of the build-up sounds like this. So that part of the drums here, you may notice all these lines. That's because you get that sort of kind of glitchy sounding effect. I took one very tiny portion of the bar and I copied it and I pasted it over a bunch of times. So this drum fill started out the same as this one. But you can see that low tom gets, or mid tom I guess, gets pasted. This is the one of the few things I actually regret doing. I feel like I like the fact that there's sort of a glitchy effect here, but I feel like I could have done one that was better executed, but it is what it is. I've already uploaded the song, so it's not a super huge deal. The second bar of the build-up is pretty similar. I just add a couple more things playing the lead, such as the return of this vital instrument, which is just such a good accent layer that fills in the top end. And then this chip sounds song again. Did I say song? I meant instrument. I'm tired. You can see some of them are playing the normal lead, like the 2 vital synths are playing the normal lead. Whereas the chip sounds and the music box are playing the sort of fast, arpeggiated, changed up lead. Then there's this bar, which is such a staple of Stardust. If you've heard any of the previous versions, there's always a 1-bar break before the drop. Usually it's a bell just playing 8th notes, so it'll go bum, 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 bum. And then you'll hit the drop. That actually does happen later, and we'll get to that, but at the beginning here, to fill in that gap, is this vital synth with the sort of stuttering going on, and it makes for a pretty unique and interesting fill before the drop. And I guess we'll move on to drop number 1. So obviously there's a lot going on here. There's like 11 different tracks playing instruments at the moment. One thing that I forgot to mention is that I'm a college student. I don't have a lot of money. I've had Ableton Live intro since I started this, meaning every single song I've made that you've heard has been limited to 16 tracks max. which is really annoying sometimes. So you can see in this one I've actually only used 15 because over the course of that time I've learned how to effectively reuse instruments, as it's really difficult to make big projects like this when you're constrained to only having 16 different MIDI tracks. And not to mention the audio tracks you might need for even stuff like sound effects, like for these risers and that's a whole track. And for the Brainstormer synth that does the risers, that only happens twice in the whole 6-minute song, and there's a whole track for that. You know what I mean? The drop itself has a lot of the same elements as the earlier parts. It's this same vital synth, this same pad, this same vital synth, that awesome piano thing from before, the Darkseid playing the octave bass, the music box, the electric bass, all of these elements. All of those are the same as in the earlier sections. What makes this more drop-like is the 3 new things. So for one, there's this piano. It's really nothing more than a layer. I use Keyzone Classic. It's the piano I've used for the longest time. I use the Steinway piano preset and just apply some effects. Sounds pretty good for being free. Sorry, we'll read about that later. And the chip sounds is playing the lead. So the lead and the drop of Stardust, if you remember the original, is just the same as the beginning sections. It just sounds like this. But there are 3 different leads that play throughout the original Stardust. There's that one, there's this one, and then there's a third one that plays, that actually plays in this one later on, but we'll get to that when we get there. So for the first bar of the drop, it is playing this lead. That's also what the piano was playing. You hear that sort of dissonant coming in at the end there? That's something that was in the original Stardust that was not in Stardust V2 that I brought back because it sounds awesome. The final thing to talk about for the first bar here is the drums, which I'm so happy with. They are just absolutely ridiculous. Like, have a look at this. So, I have double layered kick drums when the kicks are playing on their own. Then there's the snares, which are very loud and punchy. There's constant rides, which sort of function like hi-hats normally would. Every other hit, there is an open hi-hat. And then there's toms at the end of pretty much every bar. Second bar is almost the same, there's just a more aggressive fill at the end. Same goes for the second half here, which is almost the exact same. Except you may notice it cuts off there because there's a different fill, which would be this one, which is just constant kick drums, all the toms, the odd snare drum, and up here there is closed hi-hats. Couldn't tell you why. The second bar of the drop is where it gets more interesting. The idea was for me to include elements and leads and references and melodies from other projects of mine in this, because, you know, this is kind of the magnum opus of what I've done. It's a remaster of my first original. It's me accumulating all the skills I've gained over time. So the first one that plays is Megalovania, which a lot of people picked up on. It's there because, well, I did do a remix of it a long time ago. It is unlisted. The reason Megalovania is there is because it shows up in the medley, and it shows up as sort of the inspiration for Stardust, like I talked about at the beginning of the video. You hear one bar of the of the Megalovania melody. This next part is from Ultranova. That's the lead from Ultranova, which was a song I released before this. This is from Limelight. So the reason it doesn't quite sound like Limelight is because it's offset a little bit. Like in Limelight, these would be more aligned with the beats, but it is the same notes. Then there's a small break fill before the second half of the drop right here. So all that is me cutting out a bit of the lead and letting the drums and this riser play. And then on the fill, when that happens, we hear the, ba ba ba, which is the end of the Stardust melody to carry us into the second half of the drop, which is this. So these references are, this is a melody from Glimmer, which is part of the Gridfell soundtrack I worked on. As the last note gets held here from the Glimmer, these chords that play, you may recognize those if you're an Undertale fan as being from both Core and Another Medium, which I made a remix of, and it was also when I tested out a new visualization that I ended up not going with, and ended up being a pretty popular thing. The last element of the drop here is just completely original. It just had to carry into the little break part here, and you can also hear the pitch fall at the end, which happens with a few of the lead instruments. But yeah, with the first drop out of the way, that carries us into the first little break part here. So we get into a break with a held note from the drop and a crash. You may notice the BPM falling. So in this part, we have some wider chords being played by some of the instruments. So here's the Vital synth from before. We also have the Spelldosa music blocks. And the piano, which is now actually playing some chords instead of just the lead. And again, you can hear the project slowing down. If I have a look at the automation here, it goes from 185 down to 171. As we get into the second bar here, it gets a little more intense as we get our first usage of this impact sound effect, which is going to show up in a few other places. So the second bar sounds like this. So this is obviously just some big, epic, I guess is the word I'd use, sort of build-up. This melody here that all these instruments are playing is from the intro, if you remember. It's a slightly modified version of it. Then we get into the second half, which is just building more on this. So to explain what's going on there, it's simply... most of the stuff is the same from before, but a couple of the instruments have this additional lead layer added onto them. You can hear in the high end. As well as the introduction of this orchestral instrument. This is one I made out of a few different other instruments. It's a chain, and this is probably one of my best ever custom instruments. Just listen to this. So there's a tiny little break here where we get the impact and the strings rise. The reason that's there is because originally that wasn't there, and it just cut right into the orchestral section, but it sounded a little bit off. It was quite jarring, super harsh. So I added that little transition bit, and that gets us into the sort of orchestral build-up here. So this will be pretty fast to explain. I started with the strings here, and you can see these are just some chords that slowly build on themselves. This melody here was just completely made up. It sounded a little static, just having the same chord repeat 4 times, and then I carried that over to go up. to the next part, which leads us perfectly into the next section. Some other instruments also join in the build-up after the first bar. So the section, I guess. I'm not good at music theory. The first section here is just the strings. But then we have the vital synth joining for the second one. You can hear it slowly build up there, actually. And then for the third section, we have the piano. And then the bass kicks in for the last one. And then there's, of course, the drums doing a little lead-in. And then we get into our first orchestral section. This is a completely original creation. I could have theoretically ended the Stardust Remaster right here at the 2.5 minute mark. It's slightly long for a song of mine. Or pretty average, actually, these days. And I could have ended it there, and it would have sounded better than Stardust, but it wouldn't have been something, grand. It wouldn't have been a showcase of what I wanted it to be. I wanted this to be a milestone. That's why the title says, Welcome to Era 5. If you don't know what that means, I've sort of mentally divided my channel up into eras based on how good what I was producing was. The beginning of Era 4 was Beyond Me, which is the first song which I believe correctly conveyed emotion. And so the Stardust Remaster is the beginning of Era 5, which is also why there hasn't been content in a while, because I'm holding myself to a ludicrously high standard, which can be damaging, but, I think it'll end up being a good thing. Alright, back to the orchestral section. This is a completely original thing, just to add another piece to the Stardust Remaster. The only thing that's really from Stardust is there is the chord progression, obviously. You sort of that drop D-flat minor, and there's also some references to earlier bits of the Stardust melody, like in here when it does this, right? You can hear that, but that's kind of a Stardusty thing going on. But for the most part, this is actually completely original, so it sounds like this. So this section here, actually, where the lead goes like this, that is a slight bit of the third lead that plays in the original Stardust, which won't show up again until a little bit later in the song, but it shows up now to kind of tease that it is there and it is going to show up. There's one more bar of the orchestral section because 2 bars just simply wasn't long enough. It didn't feel like a decent enough part of the song. And then we get into Buildup number 2. A lot of this stuff was done on a whim. I was experimenting super hard. I wanted something original, something powerful, something unlike anything I had done before. So I said, okay, let's bring back that sort of bass from the intro, where it goes down, up, or up, down, and then down again, right? And I figure, okay, that sounds pretty neat, but I didn't want the 4th note to be there, because then it just carries on, it's muddy. So I put a break in there, and I had, it stopped after this note. I said, okay, so I'll loop that, and I did that a couple other times, but it just sounded pretty boring, and it sounded out of place, so it needed more substance. So after the first iteration, the drums kick in. And the drums kind of helped us speed it up in terms of feel, and there is one instrument playing the Stardust lead, which is that chip sound. In this break, again, the bass cuts out, but the lead continues to play, and the drums do a bit of a different fill here. You hear that sort of aggressive ride bell sound that's pretty notable for this. And then we do finally release to the lowest note of the bass on the final bar here. So we're getting into drop 2 now. This is where we finally hear the return of what was before the drop in the original Stardust, the sort of 8th note bells I was talking about. So there's actually isn't a bell instrument in this project, but combining the music box with the chip sounds instrument gave a similar effect, and the delay on the chip sounds instrument just adds another layer there. And you can hear they slowly increase in volume before finally we hit drop number 2. So unlike the first drop, which used the second Stardust lead, the second drop is using the first Stardust lead. And, it just worked out like that. Except it's using the obviously more modified version for the Stardust Remaster with all the arpeggios and stuff in it. And so we get that for a segment here, and we get that again in the second segment. You hear that the last bar is different though. It goes like this. And that is the third Stardust lead. So kind of abruptly, but I think it's a good thing because it appears. We get the third Stardust lead, and we get a lead in here. This is the introduction of the electric guitar in the song, this one here. It plays on the second segment of that build-up. You can hear it sort of down there. And there's also this drum fill, because, we like drum fills here. And then we go into the same backing instruments as the rest of the second drop, except now we have the third Stardust lead playing. In the second half of the drop here, we have the chip sounds instrument interjecting the second lead along with the third lead. Which you can hear very subtly in the mix, actually. A couple other details to mention about this part of the drop is we have the orchestral instrument playing the lead. Along with the electric guitar, of course. You can hear this is actually not a very good sounding instrument, and that's because this is actually the guitar from Beyond Me, which is a very subtle tone, but the reason I kind of get away with it is because with everything else in the mix being so grand, it kind of drowns out the subtlety of the electric guitar, and you just sort of hear the punchiness. Your brain kind of assumes that the guitar sounds good because of everything else around it. The guitar also plays that sort of interjected second melody and third melody thing. And finally, there's the introduction of this little break sample. I'm usually not one to use drum samples in this, but it adds a good layer and also makes for some good fills here in a minute. For the third bar of drop number 2, or the second half of drop 2, I guess, there's a lot of different sections of this song. We go back to the original melody. So, but to talk about here, there are some instruments, like this one, and this one, that are still playing the third lead. So that kind of helps the flow carry through, but the rest of them are playing the normal lead. And at the end of that segment here, there's this tiny little fill interjection. You hear the impact sound, and you hear this break sample. It just helps to cut through, because, for the past, how long is this segment? For the past, 45 seconds or so, your ears have just been subjected to a lot of really loud, big sounds, and so it's nice to have a little bit of a break. So we'll be getting into my favorite part of the song here in a second. How long have I been recording for? 38 minutes. Okay, so we're probably, 20 minutes into the video by now? Holy shit, okay. There's going to be 2 people total who watch through all of this. The final segment of drop number 2 here is almost the same as the one before it, but the parts that are playing the original Stardust melody are no longer playing the plain one, they're playing the arpeggiated one that was part of the remaster. Also, we get a bar of, how do I explain it? It's not a break, well, it's because there's a break sample. A lot of terms in music really suck. It's this part, which is just kind of a really long fill, I guess. You can almost call it a solo, before we get to the, actual drum fill into the next part. In this part, I dub the melodic part. Originally, the Stardust Remaster ended here after the second drop. It did this, and it did the bum 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 bum, and then it hit a last note, like it does at the end of the project, and that was it. But I said, no, this isn't good enough. This feels too much like I just took Stardust and turned some instruments up and made it sound a little better, right? Even though there's already some really cool stuff before this, there needs to be more. So I went out of my way, and for the first time in any version of Stardust, I actually changed the chord progression from being in that sort of drop D-flat to, I don't even know what you call this. Here it is. It's just something different I came up with on a whim. One of the defining features about this is the triplets. There's this triplet arpeggio played by the piano and by the music box. That was a lot of fun to make. Something I should mention is I don't really play any of my music in, despite the fact that I have a MIDI keyboard. This was all drawn by hand with this pencil, so obviously it took a while. Accompanying that are some instruments playing just the bass line of the new chord, such as this pad, the darpsichord, and the actual bass guitar. The only thing really missing now is the strings, which play the chords. Altogether, you get this sort of sound. In section 2 of this, you can hear the drums. They start to add some accents. That was a triplet there, an extended triplet. And, the build up into the next section. There's the lead instruments, which begin playing sort of a simple version of the Stardust melody. Oh, go away, Windows, you ruined that. Yeah, so it has this part, which is, very typical of Stardust. But then it changes to match sort of the new chord progression that we've gotten. That was a lot of fun in making it sounding pretty good. Something interesting here is when you match up the drum, like triplet notes here, versus these 3 notes, right? They don't quite line up, and it makes for a very interesting, I'm not going to say polyrhythm because it isn't, but you can hear by comparing this to this, it sounds like a little off the grid. Yeah, and you kind of get that mixture of sounds, and it's just appealing. Nothing else really new in that section until we hit the build up here and we go into the next part. Really, the only thing different here is now there's an actual drum part being played. And the first vital instrument is playing the lead. Doesn't really add too much. Altogether, you get this sound. Another sort of break there. The bass instruments cut out, and so do the drums, but the leads continue to play. The chords cut out too, but the leads continue to play, and you get that impact sound again. So this next section is the same chord progression from the new section before it, but now we do have the original Stardust melody playing over that chord progression, which obviously required tweaking it a fair amount. So if I play what just the lead is sounding like, you know what I mean? It just sounds a little bit different, but it works out very well, and it's quite melodic. There's another bar of it, but it's just a repeat with the electric guitar playing that melody now too. Maybe electric guitar kick in. Now for my favorite fill in the entire song, and that would be this one. So the BPM has to slow down, obviously. So we go from 182 to 171, and over the course of that, there's this fill playing. So the drums are doing this sort of repeated tom motion until it releases at the end, like so. And because the drums are doing that, you almost don't hear the tempo slow down. You obviously can hear it, but it makes it a lot less jarring. And then accompanying that are just bits of the arpeggio from the section previous. And they sound like this. And then a held note at the end to carry us into the next section, as well as an impact sound at the start, and you get this fill. So now we get, what would this be? Break 3, Buildup 4? I'm not entirely certain. But this section, you can hear that we head back to the same melody that was in the intro. Only now it's accompanied by the traditional Stardust melody being played in chip sounds and on the music box. So this was an interesting choice I made, and I'm not entirely sure what led me to do it, but I think it was a good decision. Here, instead of having another drop, we have a sort of slowed down version, but we're using the lead from drop 1. The drums are kind of playing this halftime thing. We even get this part here where I'm using some melodies from other projects. You may not have noticed it there, but the project sped back up. It's very subtle, and it takes place over the course of this entire bar. But we go from 173 up to 183, and eventually 186, but it's kind of juddery to get there. So this feels a little bit interesting. I have used a lot of breaky fills like this in this song, and it started to get a little repetitive, so I wanted something different. So you get the impact, and all you have is that break sample from before. And that's the first bar. And then you get the 8th note bells from the original Stardust, as well as the bass instruments fading in just like the intro, and a reverse version of the impact sound as a sort of riser to lead us into the hit of the final drop in the final segment of the song. So that is almost the exact same. In fact, it might be the exact same as the first bar from drop number 1, way back at the beginning of the song. Then we repeat it again, except this time the chip sounds, which is kind of the main lead sound right now, is playing octaves of the lead, so it sounds more intense. We're kind of building into something big, right? You can feel that. And then we switch to lead number 3. And then, sort of poetically, the final thing, we go back to lead number 1, that traditional Stardust sound, to carry us out to the end of the song. And at the end, there's a big, long-held note with all the instruments playing that final chord before an impact at the very end. And, of course, we have that riser leading us into it, that square riser, that brainstormer instrument from before, because we want this to feel like a very, big, impactful finish. And so, in just 6.5 minutes, you can make a decent version of a 4-year-old project. So, this song obviously is massive. Like, look at this. This is ridiculous. This is the biggest project I've worked on. It's one of the longest songs I've ever released, and I pulled out sort of all the stops that I possibly could. This is very much the limit of my current skill set. I hope to, but I'm certain I will eventually make something better. But as it stands right now, this is like the ceiling of my abilities, and I honestly couldn't be more proud of it. It has 150 views right now, which, isn't a lot by YouTube standards, but it's a lot by me standards, especially given that it's only been out for a couple of months. A successful video for me after 5 months of being uploaded is like only 100 views, so I'm glad people seem to like it. The view duration is proving that people are sitting through the entire song, which is impressive because it's 6.5 minutes of something I made, and attention spans aren't what they used to be these days. But yeah, so I had a few people question what the music production process was like for this, especially about things like the percussion. I hope I talked about the percussion a decent amount. I know there was one person in particular who was very curious about it. I talked about what instrument I use, what effects I put on the percussion, and really the actual beats themselves are just trial and error, right? The only thing I can really say that kind of makes it my style is there's a lot of tom drums and a lot of like tiny little tom fills. So, there's a lot of that, and I think that kind of makes up the bulk of the sound. I like to think I did the original justice. It was my first real song, I'd like to say. God damn, it makes me hate the JoJo remix so much because it has 43,000 views and it's just before Stardust and it's so terrible and I really want to unlist it, but that's besides the point. To anyone who made it to the end of this analysis, thank you very much for sitting through this. The video is probably at least 40 minutes long by now, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's probably going to be the longest video I've ever uploaded. And I don't expect this to get views, but something for me to put out, and I don't care about getting views. I'm glad I have a documentation of this process. This was about a week of work where I worked on it for a couple hours a day, so you could say it's about 14 hours on a project, which some producers will spend 120 hours on a project, and they'll obviously make something way better than this, but for me 14 hours is a lot of effort to put in, especially given that I was in college at the time, and I honestly couldn't be more proud. But yeah, so, thank you for watching. Sorry there hasn't been any new music as of late. There is Fruit Salad, which I put out about a month ago. I think Fruit Salad is my best new original lately. It's quite good. I enjoy the chord progression in it. I do have some projects I'm working on right now that, hopefully at least one of them will get finished relatively soon. But, I hope this video could tide you guys over in the meantime. But yeah, all of that being said, thank you very much for watching and sitting through this all. In the description is a link to my Discord server if you're interested in joining. It's not super active these days, but there is a decent community there of people who are, just as into music as I think you would be if you sat through all of this. As well as a link to my Buy Me a Coffee, where you can support me for only a few dollars a month, and you get access to high-quality WAV file and hopefully soon FLAC file downloads of all of my music, where you can hear stuff like this in all of its glory without YouTube's compression. Yeah, thank you all very much once again, and have a good day.